You are now tuned into Daily Discussions with Dena. Join in the discussion right here, Monday through Friday at 12:30 p.m.
Welcome to your daily discussions with Dena. As always, you are welcome to take part in this discussion. So subscribe and leave your comment. I, like many others, am aware and I see what is going on in the world. There are wars and rumors of wars. And as much as I would like to believe that there is an abundance of good in this world, I cannot simply look over or pretend that immoral, corrupt, and unscrupulous beings are not empowered and can and do exhibit some of the most evil and wicked behavior on this planet, especially to those whom they consider to be beneath them. Now, I descended from a group of people that even some would refer to as the cornerstone that the builders rejected here in America and even around the world. Descendants of ancient people, people that have been on this earth for trillions of years, responsible for civilizing much of the world. And we have had to suffer at the hands of those whom saw us as less than themselves, less than human, and saw us as undeserving of basic necessities and exploited because of our general compassionate nature. People tend to take advantage of those who show compassion or see it as a weakness. Black people have experienced some of the most cruel, inhumane, and hateful treatment on this planet. And even though we are still in the midst of our own Holocaust, shamelessly, the benevolence of our true nature deep within us naturally triggers us to feel empathy for those we see aggrieved or tormented as we were and as we are at times. And even though there was no loud or overwhelming chorus of nations insistent upon ending our oppression, our subjugation, or even a simple demand by another group of people that we, Black descendants of slaves, be set free, or even that our captives or our subduers repair or attempt to restore us to the people that we once were. There is no loud chorus of people saying, give them their reparations. And that is what I mean when I say repair. I mean giving us land and resources and the means that have been denied us for centuries so that we may have the ability to build a society of our own in which we govern ourselves and can become and be free of what we have had to experience here in America. Even though many others who weren't in America per se have experienced some of the same things, they too should go to those people who subjugated them and demand the same. There was not a single group, a nation, a country anywhere that stands even today with us in our demand today for reparations or behind us at that time when we were subjugated physically. Even under the brutality, it was no one out there fighting for us and speaking to our pain. That is true even today. Unfortunate to say, but even some of our own African brethren believe that we should not be repaired from our Holocaust experience. Yet most of us will stand and we will fight with them and for their own liberation today. We have always encouraged and supported liberation and deliverance from any subjugators, especially those that consider themselves to be somehow supreme in comparison. It is difficult to sit back and see genocide or ethnic cleansing being done to people of any group and just remain silent because we know what we have experienced. In spite of that fact, that no other country of people did the same for our own, here in these Americas, I can think of no nation, I just can't, that demanded master's feet be removed from our necks. It was like we represented this story in the Bible with Hiram. And I see us as that traveler that was traveling along that road and was knocked in the head and robbed and left lying in the road. So many people came and looked at us. They looked upon us and saw our condition, but they kept rolling, did nothing to help us. Some came, saw us, even checked to see if there was anything upon us that they could take for themselves and exploit. And still, they left us on the ground. Some came, they pointed their finger, laughed, and even today they make mockery of our history. I see that all the time. Oh, you all were slaves. You all was in the field. And they make mockery of our history and the prevailing residual effects that has kept many of us mentally and physically in a subjugated condition. Many today even deny the lasting effects that slavery has had and continue to have upon us even today. But as we continue to treat that wound that left us laying in the road, and as we continue to rise up from that state, we fall back down, but we get back up. We stagger a bit, but even in the midst of our own personal holocaust, arising from that dead state, that dying condition, we still find ourselves having empathy, compassion, and even having pity for those that find themselves in such a condition. There's just no way I can see or hear about the killing of over 9,600 people, souls, and say nothing and feel nothing. It is just not something that should even be considered by any means normal. That is a huge number. I'm thinking there's not even that many people in the city in which I live. So that means you can take out an entire city or town of people. I was so flabbergasted. I had to check the numbers again. And I thought to myself, who does that? Who does this? What kind of people or person thinks that it is okay or even acceptable? That's horrific. That's a lot of human beings. And what do you do with that kind of carnage? Now, I'm not denying or saying that their war is not sometimes inevitable, but is this actually a war that we are witnessing here? Because it gives the appearance of being more of a bloodbath, or what some refer to as ethnic cleansing. And the common thread all over the media seems to be the exact same talking point. We stand with Israel. Israel has the right to defend himself or itself. Everyone has the right to defend itself, but no one is condoning senseless brutality. As we all observe what the news chooses to show or tell us about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, there is a clear bias and predisposition toward America's ally, Israel, when reporting the news, which begs the question, what are we missing? What is being withheld, and why isn't the UN stopping this? Why is this being allowed? It is such an inhumane atrocity to continue. I heard one report that said that this is to continue, that Israel has said that this is to continue for several more weeks. Can you imagine the number of human lives that will be lost? It's a slaughter. Many, many innocent people, including women, children, and the elderly. It is completely horrific, just the thought. Can you imagine being surrounded by so much death? Now, listening to others who have actually visited Palestine and Israel speak on the conditions and circumstances that they can really cause you to question what it is that we are actually witnessing that is taking place before our very eyes. And I just wanted to share just a little bit of what people are saying that have actually been there and witnessed what we only see on TV. And I just found it mind-boggling. Let's take a listen. This is U.S. Marine Corps Officer Scott Ritter, and this is what he said in an interview when he was speaking about Israel and this war.
Israel does not want a Palestinian state, never has, won't tolerate it. They've talked about it, but they knew they were never going to allow it to happen. And one of the ways they prevented it from happening was to create a division within the Palestinian population. So they promoted Hamas, they funneled money into Hamas, they openly collaborated with Hamas, even though I don't think Hamas understood they were being collaborated with, and they empowered Hamas. The United States is looking at a bigger picture, and the bigger picture, it requires stability in the Middle East. In order to do that, we need Saudi Arabia on our side. We need Iran to be pacified. We need the Arab world to be doing what we wanted to do. That is our big picture. And we're not going to let Israel get in the way. It has eliminated the one major obstacle to peace in the Middle East. That is Israeli intransigence about a Palestinian state. That's gone. There will be a Palestinian state. Israel has no choice but to accept this. It will be dictated to them by the United States, by the international community, because the international community is turning on Israel as we speak. As I said, you can only drop so many bombs on a helpless civilian population before people call you out for being the war criminals that you are. So I think going forward, we're going to be seeing a different Israel, and this is the game changer.
This next speaker is Ta-Nehisi Coates. He is an author and a writer, and he is speaking on segregation and apartheid, the regime and what he experienced when he visited the West Bank. Take a listen.
Oh, wow. I spent 10 days in Palestine, in the occupied territories, and in Israel proper. I've had the great luxury over the past 10 years of seeing a few countries. I have not spent more time or seen more of another country or another territory than I did this summer. I think what shocked me the most was in any sort of opinion piece or reported piece or whatever you want to call it that I've read about Israel and about the conflict with the Palestinians, there's a word that comes up all the time, and it is complexity. That and its closely related adjective, complicated. And so while I had my skepticisms and I had my suspicions of the Israeli government, of the occupation, what I expected was that I would find a situation in which it was hard to discern right from wrong. It was hard to understand the morality at play. It was hard to understand the conflict. And perhaps the most shocking thing was I immediately understood what was going on over there. Probably the best example I can think of is the second day when we went to Hebron, and the reality of the occupation became clear. We were driving out of East Jerusalem. I was with Palestinian, with PalFest. And we were driving out of East Jerusalem into the West Bank, and you could see the settlements, and they would point out the settlements. And it suddenly dawned on me that I was in a region of the world where some people could vote and some people could not. And that was obviously very, very familiar to me. I got to Hebron, and we got out as a group of writers, and we were given a tour by a Palestinian guide. And we got to a certain street, and he said to us, "I can't walk down this street. If you want to continue, you have to continue without me." And that was shocking to me. And we walked down the street, and we came back, and there was a market area Hebron is very, very poor. It wasn't always very poor, but it is very, very poor. Its market area has been shut down. But there are a few vendors there that I wanted to support. And I was walking to try to get to the vendor, and I was stopped at a checkpoint. Checkpoints all through the city. The checkpoints obviously all through the West Bank. Your mobility is completely inhibited, and the mobility of the Palestinians is totally inhibited. And I was walking to the checkpoint, and an Israeli guard stepped out, probably about the age of my son. And he said to me, "What's your religion, bro?" And I said, "Well, I don't, I'm not really religious." And he said, "Come on, stop messing around. What is your religion?" I said, I'm not playing. I'm not really religious. And it became clear to me that unless I professed my religion and the right religion, I wasn't going to be allowed to walk forward. So he said, "Well, okay, so what was your parents' religion?" I said, "Well, they weren't that religious either." He says, what were your grandparents' religion?" And I said, "My grandmother was a Christian." And then he allowed me to pass. And it became very, very clear to me what was going on there. And I have to say, it was quite familiar. Again, I was in a territory where your mobility is inhibited, where your voting rights are inhibited, where your right to the water is inhibited, where your right to housing is inhibited, and it's all inhibited based on ethnicity. And that sounded extremely, extremely familiar to me. And so the most shocking thing about my time over there was how uncomplicated it actually is. Now, I'm not saying the details of it are not complicated. History is always complicated. Present events are always complicated. But the way this is reported in the Western media is as though one needs a PhD in Middle Eastern studies to understand the basic morality of holding a people in a situation in which they don't have basic rights, including the right that we treasure most, the franchise, the right to vote. And then declaring that state a democracy. It's actually not that hard to understand. It's actually quite familiar to those of us with a familiarity to African American history. Israel's a segregated society. The occupied territories are segregated. The Jews segregated. It's not, hard to understand. There are different signs for where different people can go. There are different license plates forbidding different people from going different places. Now, what the authorities will tell you is that this is a security measure. But if you go back to the history of Jim Crow in this country, they would tell you the exact same thing. People always have good reasons besides, I hate you and I don't like you to justify their right for imposing an oppressive regime on other people. It's never quite that simple. And so that was the first thing. But the second thing I think that you're referring to is, this is like really personal for me. Because I came up in a time and in a place where I did not really understand the ethic of nonviolence. And by ethic, I mean the notion that violence, because I understood the rage that comes when you have a history of oppression. I understood the anger. I understood the sense of humiliation that comes when people subject you to just manifold oppression, to genocide, and people look away from that. I come from the descendants of 250 years of enslavement. I come from a people who sexual violence and rape is marked in our very bones and in our DNA. And I understand how when you feel that the world has turned its back on you, how you can then turn your back on the ethics of the world. But I also understood how corrupting that can be. I was listening to actually my congressman last night, or I guess it was a journalist asked him, how many children, how many people must be killed to justify this operation? Is there an upper limit for the number of people that could be killed when you would say this is just too much? This just doesn't, compute. This does not add up. And I have to tell you, that congressman couldn't give a number. And I thought, that man has been corrupted. That man has lost himself. He's lost himself in humiliation. He's lost himself in vengeance. He has lost himself in violence. I keep hearing this term repeated over and over again. The right to self-defense. What about the right to dignity? What about the right to morality? What about the right to be able to sleep at night? Because what I know is if I was complicit, and I am complicit, in dropping bombs on children, and dropping bombs on refugee camps, no matter who's there, it would give me trouble sleeping at night. And I worry for the souls of people who can do this and can sleep at night.
I stand corrected. There has now been over 10,000 people killed by Israel. And this stemmed from the October 7th Hamas coordinated surprise offensive on Israel. There are tens of thousands of people that are displaced and fleeing for their lives. And Israel has mobilized troops along the Gaza border, preparing for a ground attack. And there was a total blockade of the Gaza Strip. It is here that Israel stopped the supply of food, the supply of fuel, and essential commodities to the enclave. I even heard that they cut off the water. So these people could not even have basic water, which is said to be under the international law, it can be considered a war crime. But for us to better understand this Israel-Palestine conflict, one has to go back to its roots. And it started with a colonial act that was carried out more than a century ago. It is said to have started with the Balfour Declaration. Britain's Foreign Secretary at that time, who was Arthur Balfour, wrote a letter addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild, a figurehead of the British Jewish community. It is said to have been just 67 words, and it committed the British government to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and to facilitating the achievement of this objective. Now, that letter again is referred to as the Balfour Declaration. Now, it was a European power that had promised this movement, a country where the Palestinian Arab natives then made up more than 90% of the populations. So a British mandate was created in 1923 and lasted until 1948. During that period, the British facilitated mass Jewish immigration. Many of the new residents were fleeing Nazism in Europe, and they also faced protests and strikes. Palestinians were alarmed by their country's changing demographics and British confiscation of their lands to be simply handed over to Jewish settlers. On May 15, 1948, Israel announced its establishment. The following day, the First Arab-Israeli War began, and fighting ended in January 1949 after an armistice between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. In December 1948, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194, which calls for the right of return for Palestinian refugees. At least 150,000 Palestinians remain in the newly created state of Israel and live under a tightly controlled military occupation for almost 20 years before they were eventually granted Israeli citizenship. Now, Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, and in 1950, Jordan began its administrative rule over the West Bank. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO as it is called, was formed, and a year later, the Fatah political party was established. June 1967, Israel occupied the rest of historic Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Syrian Golan Heights, and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula during the Six-Day War against a coalition of Arab armies. For some Palestinians, this led to a second forced displacement, hijackings by leftist groups drew the world's attention to the plight of the Palestinians. Settlement construction began in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, a two-tier system was created, with Jewish settlers afforded all the rights and the privileges of being Israeli citizens, whereas Palestinians had to live under a military occupation that discriminated against them and barred any form of political or civic expression. That sounds very familiar. Now, the first Palestinian Intifada erupted in the Gaza Strip in December 1987 after 4 Palestinians were killed when an Israeli truck collided with 2 vans carrying Palestinian workers. There were protests. It also led to the establishment of the Hamas movement, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that engaged in armed resistance against the Israeli occupation. The Israelis' army heavy-handed response was encapsulated by the break their bones policy that was advocated by then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It included summary killings, closures of universities, deportations of activists, and destructions of homes. The Intifada was primarily carried out by young people and was directed by the Unified National Leadership of the Uprising, a coalition of Palestinian political factions committed to ending the Israeli occupation and establishing Palestinian independence. Interim government that was granted limited self-rule in pockets of the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. The PLO recognized Israel on the basis of a two-state solution and effectively signed agreements that gave Israel control of 60% of the West Bank and much of the territory's land and water resources. Now, the PA was supposed to make way for the first elected Palestinian government running an independent state of its own in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with its capital in East Jerusalem, but that never happened. So critics of the PA view it as a corrupt subcontractor to the Israeli occupation that collaborates closely with the Israeli military in clamping down on dissent and political activism against Israel. In 1995, Israel built an electronic fence, a concrete wall around the Gaza Strip, and snapping interactions between the split Palestinian territories. There was a second Intifada. Israel reoccupied areas governed by the Palestinian Authority and began construction of a separation wall along the rampant settlement construction destroyed Palestinian livelihoods and it destroyed communities. Settlements are considered to be illegal under international laws, but over the years, hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers moved to colonies built on land that had been taken from the Palestinians. The space for Palestinians is constantly shrinking as settlers' only roads and infrastructure slice up the occupied West Bank, and it forces the Palestinian cities and towns into Bantustans, the isolated enclaves for Black South Africans that the country's former apartheid regime created. At the time of the Oslo Accords, when it was signed, just over 110,000 Jewish settlers lived in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Today, the figure is more than 700,000, living on more than 100,000 hectares or 390 square miles of land expropriated from the Palestinians. Gaza has been living for 16 years under blockade. Israel's land, air, and sea blockade. It has trapped more than 2 million people inside the Gaza Strip. That is since 2007. And it is stated that no portion of Gaza's society or economy has been left untouched. Now tell me, what do you think about this subject, about this discussion? Be sure to subscribe and leave me your comment. And join me for my next daily discussion with Dena. Ta-ta!
This concludes the Daily Discussions with Dena. Join us Monday through Friday at 12:30 p.m. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment.